Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope you're doing well. Um, we're working on research designs, and many of you have already begun communicating with me about your ideas, your insights, your questions. I'm so excited about all the work that you're doing. I've been helping you to refine your questions and to think more carefully about variables and method and data. It's a really fun exercise. But many of us, if not all of us, probably still have questions about, what this might look like, or how to write the introductory paragraph, or just how to sort of present the key parts of the research design. So what I thought would be useful for today is to sort of go step by step through an example or an outline of what I would do if I were to approach this assignment myself. Now, of course, you don't have to do what I would do, and I would never suggest that there's only one way to do this. There are many ways to skin a cat. It's up to you, and you can be creative and still analytical and incisive. But I always think that an example can go a long way in showing you how to approach a technical or a more I guess structured assignment of this kind, where you sort of have key criteria that you need to meet and satisfy in order to produce an effective research design. And that's what the objective is here. So I'll give you an example and we'll walk through the process. And what I'll eventually do is sort of write an introductory paragraph that highlights the key parts of the design and how you could present them in your own introduction if you have questions about that. Now, before we get started, just some housekeeping. It is the final week, and as you know, we've got the final exam uh, about a week from today or more. If it's either the 14th or the 12th, don't quote me, but we're going to review for the exam on Friday. Okay. So actually, hold on. Let me grab the syllabus and just clarify that that's sort of an important detail. And it is on the 12th. Yes. May 12th from 8 to 11 a.m. And so on Friday, we will review for the exam. And I'll prepare a review guide, as I often do, always do. And we'll go through it piece by piece, and I'll give you a chance to ask questions. And of course, I'll put things in context so that everyone is situated and we're all at the same place in the class and we're prepared to go into the exam and work effectively. I'm going to quickly switch rooms. It's COVID times. You know how it is. It can be difficult to get a space where we're able to focus. All right, give me just a moment here. Okay. Yeah, it's the 12th. We established that. But thank you. So on Friday, we'll review, and I'll have a study guide prepared. We can use that as a starting point. But I encourage you to, of course, review the readings and be ready to use the readings to demonstrate knowledge and to start to think about the big picture in the class. Because as always, the questions and the content will focus on those key themes. We'll revisit everything, and everything this half of the course is fair game. It won't be cumulative. The course's themes and issues really build on themselves, and so in that regard, the class is kind of cumulative already. And as far as I'm concerned, I already tested you on the first half of the course, and we've done well in the class, and you're all in a very good position. Of course, if you are a student who is unsatisfied and concerned about your performance in the class, come talk to me. We still have office hours, and we still have a chance to get a leg up on the final exam or to prepare to effectively, produce the research design. So I'm still here to support you. And I think at this point in the class, it's about really summing up and just getting us in a position to do well on the final exam and to produce a good paper, a good research design. So that's what we'll deal with now. And I think that the best way to do this is to just give you sort of some pro tips, so to speak. And I just mean to say that this is how I would approach this. Now, as always, when I say, pick a research question, what I mean is what really interests you? What topic motivated you in the class or got you interested or had you thinking critically about the subject matter in a new way? What was really exciting for you? And for me, what's exciting is political and economic transitions. And so the topic that was interesting for me is the transition from public voting to secret voting via the introduction of a secret ballot. So the question that I would ask is, why do some countries adopt a secret ballot while others do not? Or why do some countries adopt a secret ballot earlier than others? If we, for example, find that virtually all countries have a secret ballot, which is mostly the case, why do some countries adopt it earlier than others? Or why do some countries adopt it while others do not? These are both analytical questions, and we can study the transition from public voting to secret voting via the introduction of a secret ballot by asking these kinds of questions. And so just pick your topic that you like and then just turn it into a why question by identifying some variation in that topic. It could be variation in the creation or the adoption of an institution, or variation in the type of voting or the type of information processing. It can be variation in the type of party or the linkage strategy adopted by a political party. It could be variation in party ID or voter turnout. These are all examples of questions that would be worthwhile and interesting to ask. And it's up to you, what interests you and what kind of a study would you want to do if you were to actually carry out this research. Now, the second component of this is to briefly review the relevant literature. And what this means is I want you to begin, of course, with what we studied in class, but then go outside of the class and really only use the reading from the class as a starting point. I want you to branch out and find some additional literature. 2 or 3 articles should be sufficient, and review that existing literature. And this is what other scholars have said in response to your question. So other scholars have asked the same question, and they've put forward explanations that try to shed light on that question as well. And so what are some of those explanations? And really, most importantly, why is it that those existing explanations or approaches do not work? So what do the existing explanations take for granted? What assumptions do they make that may actually vary in reality from country to country, or from time period to time period? A useful way to think about this is, what aspect of reality or what part of the outcome of interest that I'm studying do the existing explanations fail to adequately account for? What aspect of nature or the wild, so to speak, is not explained or adequately explained by these existing explanations? And so what is there a need for, right? What is the gap in the literature? Where's the space that needs to be filled? What theory do we need, or what would help us to move the goalposts, so to speak? And so you just think about, why do these existing approaches not work for my study, or what is it that they can't do for me, and what can I say about their limitations? And so at this point, you would want to go and use, for example, Google Scholar to try to find some existing research on the topic. And let me share my screen and I'll do this with you. And I'll just give you a brief sense of how quickly you can find this stuff. Causes of the adoption of secret voting. Okay, so here's one right here. TRL and Ziblatt from 2017 in comparative political studies. This is an entire issue devoted to the causes and consequences of secret ballot reform. Very interesting. This entire issue would be relevant to my research design. This is a collection of papers that explore two understudied but critical questions of enduring concern for the study of democratization. Was the secret ballot driven by the same forces that drove the rise of democracy more generally? Did the secret ballot and electoral fraud, or was its effect merely endogenous to in economic modernization more generally? So it's going into some more specific detail about different potential causes of the secret ballot. This is exactly what I need, and I found it in literally 15 seconds. I found it in like 2 seconds. I just typed in my topic and I brought up the most recent research. This is a good starting point. And what I would do is I would proceed to read a few of the articles from that collection, and then I would cite them. And I would engage with those explanations, and I would use them in my research design. So this is a good starting point. But I could also use, for instance, this article. These articles all appear to be from the same collection, and that's completely fine. That's completely fine. So what I would do is I would use articles from so for me, it would be TRL and Ziblatt. So these arguments focus on economic development and modernization, and they also focus on these larger processes that are often causes of democratization more generally in a lot of the studies. So modernization theory would be one of the explanations that I would contend with. And in economic development more generally appears to be one of the causes or the proposed causes of the transition to secret voting. Now, what's interesting is that, let me point out some of the issues with these arguments from my perspective. What's the problem with attributing secret voting to economic development? Well, the problem is saying that development causes secret voting takes the positions and interests, capacities, etc., of key political actors for granted. For example, why should we assume that economic growth causes legislators to automatically adopt secret voting? Don't right-wing parties already benefit from public voting? So wouldn't they oppose the transition to secret voting regardless of the level of economic development? So look, I'm just kind of highlighting some of the limitations of that existing argument. Yeah, I did this pretty quickly, but the point that I want to show you and make to you is that you just want to find a way to critique the existing explanations. What is it about reality that they take for granted, or are they, inadequate in explaining? What do they not do well? And for me, I study political parties and coalitions and interests and power relations. So I'm very in tune to individual actors in parties, in their interests, in the coalitions they form, in their political advantages or their benefits, and why they do stuff, what motivates them. And so for me, taking their position for granted and assuming that economic development would just cause them to behave a certain way, that is just too much of a stretch, because something has to bring those political actors to behave in such a way as to bring about the transition to secret voting. And I say quite concretely here, right-wing parties benefit from public voting. So why would they just go with the transition? They would oppose the transition. They would try to prevent a transition regardless of the level of development. So this is just an example of how you can begin to critique some of the existing literature. And this is how I would do it. So what is my hypothesis then? What do I think explains variation in secret voting? Well, what I think explains variation in secret voting is what I thought of earlier, and I'm calling relative left power. And this is the relative political power of leftist political parties. And this is relative to right-wing political parties. Why is this important? Because this is important because right-wing parties benefit from public voting because landlords and capitalists can control and supply their tenants and employees votes in exchange for political and policy favors from right-wing political parties. So right-wing political parties benefit from public voting. For the same reason, left-wing political parties are hurt by public voting because their potential voters and workers and tenants are lost to the control and manipulation of right-leaning landlords and capitalists. Now, let's complete the analysis. Right-wing, for the same reason, left-wing parties benefit from the transition to secret voting because it frees workers to vote in line with their interests and support left parties. Right-wing parties are hurt by the transition because it dilutes their control of the votes of their tenants and workers. So for these reasons, we should expect leftist parties to promote the secret ballot and to try hard to adopt the secret ballot. We should expect rightist parties, on the other hand, to oppose the secret ballot. Now, what's going to actually determine who wins out when they confront each other in the heat of political battle? Well, what's going to determine who wins out is the balance of relative party power and really the relative influence of the left and the political strength of the left. And so what matters then is the strengthening of the party left through the through the increase in the organization and density of leftist political parties, resources of leftist political parties. Now, I'm obviously measuring leftist political parties in terms of their sort of organizational strength and not their political influence, because what's inherent here is that when they get stronger organizationally, they may campaign more effectively and may ultimately win power and sort of seize the day, so to speak. But you get the idea, right? My hypothesis is, my hypotheses are these, where the leftist, the party left is stronger, countries should transition to secret voting. Where the party right is stronger, countries should return to or remain at public voting. All right, so there you go. Now I have a party-based, power relations-based model of the transition from public to secret voting. It's an issue that is of importance in democratization and in political behavior, and it's something that we could study very easily. And the way I'll study it is by using the method of difference. Now remember that this involves comparing and contrast, comparing cases with similar attributes but different outcomes for clues as to why the cases differ in outcome. And I would choose the following case. I would choose the case of, and this isn't that creative, but I'm using it because it's a case that's already important in the literature and it's got a useful break between time 1 and time 2. So Chile at time 1, before 1958, public voting. And then case 2 is Chile at time 2, after 1958. And here's the thing. Here's what's interesting, and here's why it's a useful comparison. Public voting and party right dominance. During the period leading up to 1958, public voting coincided with party right dominance, more or less. But it was around the mid-1950s that in Chile, the party left began to ascend and get quite strong and become much more influential. And really, it altered the balance of power. And the result was a tilt towards the left. And so this is my second case. And I have secret voting and party left dominance. Okay, so there you go. My cases, variables, and the values on those variables line up. I have a nice, neat method of difference, comparative design. I could study those cases and I can examine them to test my hypothesis about whether relative party strength influences the transition to secret voting. That's very doable. It's very realistic. That's something that I could do. Now, how would I do that? Where would I get the data, or where would I get the information? Well, I could study existing secondary literature, case studies in particular, because it's already been sent through the ringer and it's been vetted. It's been subject to peer review. And so secondary literature in history and political science on parties and party system in Chile. There's a lot of work on that. I could find a gold mine of information that would be useful and would help me to to determine whether my hypothesis about the balance of party strength helps me to explain the transition from public to secret voting. But I could also consider, for example, newspapers and papers from the period, interview transcripts with leftist party leaders who may talk about the importance of political power to political reforms to protect voters from intimidation. That would be all useful information, and I can find that and I can use it to try to determine if there's a plausible basis in these cases for my hypothesis. So here's what I have then. I have these different components, and now I have the issue of beginning my paper and getting started. And so we can begin in this way. Secret voting guards against, no, hold on, let's start over. Secret voting promotes democracy by safeguarding voters from bribery and intimidation. This is important because it ensures electoral integrity, increases voter turnout, and dilutes the power of landed and elite interests. So far, scholars have studied the political effects of the transition from public to secret voting. They have secret voting showing that the above effects will obtain in most cases. However, important questions about what causes countries to transition to secret voting in the first place remain largely unanswered or unconvincingly so. Why do some countries transition to secret voting while others do not? And why do some countries transition before others? That's what I have so far. Now, where do I go from here? Now that I've begun to introduce the issue and the question, what do I have to do next? Any ideas? What comes next? So we're getting a lot of input here. Yeah. So what comes next is let me not lead you any further. What comes next is we say something like this. We say, this essay proposes a research strategy for analyzing why some countries adopt secret ballot voting while others do not, or why some countries adopt it before others. That is where we say what we're doing in the paper, right? But now we need to state the thesis. Okay, so in this case, I've been arguing about the importance of relative party strength, right? And kind of the balance of power between the party right and the party left. So what I say at this point is the essay argues that differing configurations of relative party strength contribute to the divergent outcomes, and shows that this hypothesis can be tested, can be examined by examined through a small and comparative analysis of Chile before 1958 and Chile after 1958. Specifically, the design hypothesizes that where the party right is dominant, public voting will remain the order of the day. Countries will transition to secret voting where the party left has the upper hand. The conclusion, okay, so now, which part of this paragraph is the thesis statement? Which statement is the thesis statement? Yeah, the essay argues statement. So it's right here, right? So the thesis statement, and forgive me everyone if this is review for you, but I think this is very useful, right? Because when we do a research design in a political science class, it can become quite technical. And so we can think in a productive way about how to do this and how to communicate very clearly and incisively in written form. And so I think that this is useful. And so I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but I think that we all benefit from thinking about how to craft a narrative and how to get a paper off the ground. And so this is our thesis here. And it says quite clearly, it's very declarative, right? The essay argues that differing configurations of relative party strength contribute to the divergent outcomes and shows that this hypothesis can be examined through a small and comparative analysis of Chile before 1958 and Chile after 1958. And then you don't have to include this next part, but I think that including the hypothesis is useful because it tells the reader right away, what is the sort of key theoretical proposition? What is really the key axis of discovery and analysis here? And that's where you put this. Now, if you don't want to include it in the introductory paragraph, you don't necessarily have to. It's up to you. But it might be useful for your reader so that they can see what exactly you're arguing and what they should be looking for, moreover, when they actually go and begin reading the design. I've got to leave the room again because the little girl downstairs is screaming hysterically. So that's neat. Marilyn says, is this similar to an abstract? If so, does that mean we're supposed to have one? So this is not an abstract. This is sort of similar, but this is really more of an introductory paragraph where you kind of identify and contextualize and situate the question in the larger scope of the conversation about the topic, right? So the abstract would be much more rudimentary and much simpler. You don't need to have an abstract, but I would encourage you to use this sort of approach when you outline and write your introductory paragraph. So this is our thesis, and then this is our set of hypotheses, right? The testable propositions that follow from the research design that we're proposing, the research strategy. So one way of putting together this paper would be to, have this introduction where you do all of the above, and then you can, if you want, you can just do it like this. You need to have your brief literature review. You then need to move forward and form your hypothesis. And then third is your methodology and cases. And then fourth, you discuss data. And then you conclude. And when you conclude, you, of course, restate the thesis, but you don't necessarily, restate it word for word. You sort of say like, this study has suggested that this variable cannot be understood without considering X or whatever, right? You kind of church it up. You kind of make it a little more buttoned up, so to speak. So you restate the thesis, and then you identify the key political and analytical implications of your argument if it is true. That's a key part, because you're sort of saying, well, if this is correct, we should also expect the rest to be true. So it gives the reader and it gives other scientists a set of steps that they can take to continue studying the thread that you've picked out, you've begun to pull. So they'll keep pulling it if you give them a chance to pull it. And then finally, you sort of want to identify the questions that your study or research design raises. What questions arise when we begin to think about your design and how the topic might be studied? This is a useful way to conclude, because you're not just rehashing the material, you're going into new directions that still build on what you've done. Arlene is asking for a brief literature review. How many articles or journals should we look out? I think 2 or 3 is sufficient, really. In the example that I gave you, when I sought out those examples, those articles that I searched for, I would pick out 2 or 3 articles from that special edition. Those 3 articles individually would probably all address the question of what causes secret voting or the transition to secret voting. And that would be sufficient, 2 or 3. You don't need to go overboard. It's not your dissertation. Just show that you're making an effort to engage with the literature beyond what you read in class. And if you're unsure about where to go or what to search for, sometimes reading the references or the footnotes of the readings that I assigned for your given topic can be a good place to start, because that is going to be, a set of readings or other articles that are going to be relatively similar. But I want to really stress that you need to take some individual initiative and go well beyond the class material. The response essay was a response essay that was centered on the class reading. I required you to stay within the class material for that assignment. This assignment is the opposite. Now you need to go beyond the class material, and you need to take some initiative and demonstrate that you've made an effort to seek out and kind of engage with some of the existing literature. And again, that's not a big bite. Just take a small bite, a couple articles, maybe 3. No, Casey, you do not need to design your own type of research method. That would be an incredible and very interesting undertaking. There is a field in political science called political methodology, and those folks do develop new methodologies, but that's some next level stuff. So if you're interested in that, come talk to me, because I want to hear more about it. And if you're developing a new method, I would be really interested in knowing about that. But for this purpose, all you have to do is just use one of the methods that I taught you, or just, suggest the use of maybe a statistical method that would be appropriate. It depends partly on what kind of question you're asking and how you want to approach it. Some students will invariably want to use the comparative methods that I taught you. Other students may feel comfortable proposing the use of a quantitative approach. Each are equally valid, although they do serve somewhat different purposes and have different strengths. I wouldn't suggest that they're mutually exclusive, and I wouldn't suggest that one is better than the other. So Brittany's asking, and the data that we discuss is the data found in the literature. It's it's the empirical information that you would use to evaluate your hypothesis, right? So it's information or a type of information that is very likely to have been studied by scholars before you, but it doesn't necessarily need to be found in the literature. You just need to identify some source or some type of empirical information that you could use to evaluate your hypothesis. So notice mine. Look, I said secondary literature and history and political science on parties and party systems in Chile. That's, that's information that I'm looking for in the secondary literature, but I'm not examining the literature for its sake. I'm just using it for my purposes, right? I'm trying to find the information that I need to evaluate the hypothesis. And in this case, I'm also considering using newspapers and papers and other documents from the period, as well as interview transcripts. This presumably could be found in a number of places. It may not necessarily be provided in the literature, but you could find interview transcripts, for instance, in books or wherever. But for our purposes, you just need to make an effort to demonstrate that you're familiar with what kind of empirical information you would look for and use, and how you could use it for your purposes. So at this stage, I'm positive that many of you are thinking and you've got the wheels turning. What questions do you have about this assignment or about the approach that I outlined here? What can I clear up for you? Or what do you believe you need for me to support you or to feel fully supported as you complete this assignment? Ishan says, would you like the categories clearly defined in the essay? You don't need to clearly define them, but it is useful because in a more technical paper where you have these specific criteria that you need to meet, the grader or the person reading is going to want to see quickly and be able to tell that those components are included in your paper. And it might be helpful for them to not make them search for it or look too hard. And since it's a research design, it should include those components, either, more obviously or less so. If I were to do this, I would include the subsections, just because it helps to clarify the different parts of the assignment. Ernie says, do we need to include actual tables for the data, or is describing the data throughout the paragraphs enough? Well, just describe it. You don't even need to have the data. You don't even need to collect it. See, that's the thing about a research design that's beautiful. You can propose any study you want. Ideally, it's a realistic proposal and one that you could maybe do. But the truth is, the research in the data collection and the analysis is the legwork of any academic undertaking. And that's the part that takes a long, long time and can be very time consuming and expensive and risky and dangerous, but fun. That's not what we're doing here. So you don't need to include data. If you want to engage in preliminary analysis, go for it. You have my support, but it's not necessary. Arlene is asking, is there a specific writing style you would prefer? Example, MLA or Chicago? Well, my preference is always Chicago, because you can demonstrate in the footnotes the quality and the strength of your sources. That's because I use historical methods in my research. That doesn't have to be your approach. And really, I want you to make sure that you satisfy the length requirement and that nothing in that regard gets obscured. But I just want you to be consistent. If you want to use MLA or APA, great. If you're thinking about doing something qualitative and case study oriented, maybe Chicago is suitable for you. I like Chicago personally. It's my preference, but everyone is different. And I just ask that you be consistent and that you be disciplined in your use of conventions. What other questions do you have? We've got 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that anything that is unclear is aired so that we can address everything. If we would want to create our own methodology, would you prefer we include a paragraph describing how it works? Yes, but I'm going to be honest. I just don't know if that's a realistic undertaking for any of us. Just because that's really something else. I don't mean to be too unambitious, but I want us to focus squarely on the content in the class. And so I want you to think first and foremost about the issues and the topics that we studied. And so when that's the objective, I want us to approach that as simply and as effectively as we can, and to maybe focus on that objective first. And so I'm just going to be honest. Usually the development of a new methodology is like, a whole dissertation or some very, very long and arduous, highly just difficult process. And so I really, really want you to focus first and foremost on the substance of the class, political behavior, and the key issues pertaining to that. If this were a course on methodology, I absolutely would encourage you to develop and think about methodology. But that would very likely be a class that you would take as part of some advanced study in political science at a PhD granting institution as part of a course of study on methodology. So just being realistic, I want you to focus on the content. Arlene says, is there office hours? Or hold on. Casey says, do we need quotes to support our hypothesis in our hypothesis section? Not necessarily. I just ask that you ground your hypothesis and your theoretical propositions in the literature or in the work that we've read, or in the literature that you're citing or that you're grounding or that you're relying on to kind of develop your argument. So you just need to anchor it somewhere, right? You don't need to have quotes necessarily. I don't think that's essential. Arlene, I have office hours on Wednesday and Friday. You can email me always, and I encourage you to do that. Brittany asks, is our hypothesis a compliment or a criticism to the articles we choose? Well, really, it should be a different hypothesis. So essentially a critique, right? I suppose if you mean, when you say compliment, is it the same hypothesis? I would prefer that you try to generate a new idea, right? Try to think of something that is original if you can. And that then would mean that you're probably critiquing the existing literature. And so I want you to try to identify something or some variable that hasn't been considered, and then be able to make just a plausible argument about why it's worth investigating. And so that would probably then be a critique. Yes, I'll upload this to CAT courses. Yes, Samantha, I have office hours at 3:30. Another note on method. I think that the methods that I taught you are very useful here. Even if you are interested in studying like an aggregate outcome, like public opinion or political behavior or voting behavior, I still think that you can compare a small number of countries, and it can be a useful starting point. And I teach you those qualitative methods and those case study methods because they're as old as time itself, and they're road tested. There are no bells and whistles. It's just a useful way of testing hypotheses and examining causes and developing a basis or some support for a theory or some hypothesis that you might test in a larger data set later. I would really encourage you to use those. Those methods are pretty simple and straightforward, and they have they have the advantage of disciplining the way you think about the issues. And that's a useful strategy when we're trying to really generate a new argument or try to think critically about how we can study a question. And so, as much as possible, I think that the parts of this that we can sort of table and just kind of run with, like the method, that I think that that might be most worthwhile. And then with that in mind, think about, well, what is my intuition or what is my insight? What is my interest or what kind of an argument would I like to make? You know, in my example, I showed you that I was interested in relative party strength and the balance of power between political parties. That's what I'm interested in. But you might be interested in something that's different, and certainly you are. And I would encourage you just to form an argument of your own and use this as a chance to be creative. Let me take a look here. Yeah, no problem, everyone. I'm happy to do this. I think that at this stage in the class, this is a useful way for us to bring everything together, to kind of put a pin on it, so to speak. And I know that you're hard at work and we're really just summing it all up. And so I don't want to overburden you. And yeah, it's a good time to focus on some of the basics. uh, that's so funny. I think someone accidentally sent me or I think someone meant to send a private message to someone. uh, I'm not gonna say who it was, but it's funny. It's no issue. It's hilarious, actually. No, don't worry about it. Don't worry, Arlene. It's funny. I love it that this kind of stuff happens and that we have a chance to laugh about it. Look, everybody, we're out of time. I'm gonna save this and upload it so that you can use it as an outline. So great to see all of you, and you know, as always, I just want you to know that I really admire all the work that you do, and the papers that you wrote were really excellent, and that we're very excited about what you'll do with this assignment as well. So, you know, just keep plugging away. And it is the end of the semester, and I know that you're probably feeling overwhelmed, but you know, you have my full support, and I want you to know that you can email me and ask for help. I'll be in office hours as well. But you know, it was very good to see you as always, and I'll see you again on Friday, where we'll review for the final exam. Take it easy, everybody.